Oh boy, what do you get when you get a male protagonist who merely reacts to the events in his life? A female assassin who's been madly in love with him since the age of 10, but doesn't really unite with him until like 99% of the book is done? What do you get when you have underage romps through the perfumed halls of Eros, and they feel icky and infuriating, and I feel like I have to use euphemisms here in order to just come close to describing these acts because they are described explicitly in this book. All of this takes place under a sky with two moons, our ordinary one and this small, oddly shaped green one that's beside it. Well, you get Haruki Murakami's 1157-page book, 1Q84, a magnum opus that stretches the plot thinner than Stephen King's The Dome. Now, I do really love Stephen King, but The Dome was a slog for me because mostly the protagonist in that story is a reactionary protagonist. He kind of reacts to the events in his life. I get the very real sense that the protagonist in this story, Tango, is doing the same thing. Now, it is a dual narrative in which there is a female protagonist involved who gets a lot of screen time as well, and she seems to be more driven than Tango. This one appears to be an attempt to make her more interesting, but she does just end up serving the male protagonist. This book manages to meander multiple paths, but ends up going nowhere and just back to home base as far as I'm concerned. During the entire run, all of its most dynamic characters really just end up waiting in rooms. This work originally was released as 3 books. However, it would be a mistake to say that each novel stands on its own. Indeed, if it had not been for the artwork and the titles, I would have not known where one book ended and the next one began, quite honestly. This is apropos of nothing, but why is it that this is like the 3rd book of Murakami's that I've read that has kind of like an Oedipus Rex vibe to it? I mean, Sophocles wants his flex back, y'all, swear to God, because Tango is constantly picturing these memories of his mother's breasts being sucked on by other men, which is odd in and of itself, but it's repeated over and over again. Tango is constantly thinking about this. It's constantly being written about, and I can't figure out why, because it doesn't lend anything to the story, really. 1Q84 could possibly be the most challenging novel I've read in some time. Nope, the vocabulary and the prose aren't all that challenging. There's no colloquialisms that confound. The references to various locations in Japan simply serve as a backdrop. They don't require too much thought or geographical knowledge. There also are very few things in the book that require you to really think too long and hard. So it's a simple, easy, accessible book in that regard. But this kind of works against it to some degree because this book could take place anywhere. I mean, it could take place in Bangkok, Boston, Cairo, anywhere. He does manage to give you sentences that are easy to read. Indeed, even its pop culture references from days gone by have a certain expository nature to them, where the topic is detailed to the reader from the dialogue or point of view of the character experiencing these references. Like lyrics, stories, quotes, whatever. They're all explained to the reader. It's an easy to read book from that standpoint. However, for me, it's the subject matter and the overall momentum, or lack thereof, that really weighs down this already hefty book. Remember, it's 1150 pages. This one has a fair amount of sex, and that's an understatement. It has a lot of objectification of the female body. There are gratuitous lesbian sex scenes, and he stresses that they are not lesbians. And this, to me, feels a bit homophobic. It's odd that he never has gay sex scenes, too, considering how he doesn't shy away from the subject of sex. But over and over again, in explicit detail, he describes these lesbian sex scenes, but no homo. They are doing things like cunnilingus. No homo. They are doing kinky things that would make Caligula lush, but no homo. He goes overboard here describing the female anatomy. Hell, if you took the description of pubic hair and breast alone, I'm not joking, you'd probably save about a chapter's worth of material in this book. And like quite a few of his books, the protagonist ends up being less interesting than the supporting characters themselves. That is, if they are male. The female supporting characters, though interesting, tend to serve the male character anyway. The novel starts off on an elevated highway where we're introduced to our supporting character, a 30-year-old woman by the name of Omame. She has a rather unusual appointment to attend, and time is of the essence to her, so Instead of waiting in the cab stuck in traffic, she gets out of on the highway, descends a set of stairs used by utility workers, and she ends up on the street. She also suspects she is in an alternate world because a few of the things around her look different. They appear different to her. Things like police uniforms, that sort of thing. The first act is the most interesting, introducing you to most of the major characters. The world building, though not really fully fleshed out, the universe isn't really one where a lot of the details and the workings and machinations are really given to you or told to you in detail. But it does promise a wild adventure. It also introduces sexual acts as a form of verisimilitude, and this technique is repeated, guys, ad nauseum throughout the rest of the acts. Instead of gritty realism, though, we just end up with something that feels like it was written by AI because the sexual acts are so awkward and clinical. The second act slows down. It gives the reader more information on the background of some of the characters, but it also repeats the events of the first act or redescribes them over and over and over again. By the time we reach the third act, an interesting side character by the name of Yushigawa, who I actually really liked as a character, he's introduced and he maintains my interest. Until he doesn't. The problem with Yushigawa is that he ultimately discovers things about the protagonist that we, the reader, already know. Things that are often described multiple times before Yushigawa himself learns about them. This makes what would otherwise be an interesting character seem just downright superfluous to me. The third act is also remarkably slow. I mean, the momentum completely slows down here, guys. And none of the rifles sitting on shelves are ever fired by this act. Indeed, characters are often sitting in rooms daydreaming or doing things that don't amount to much, and this causes the last two chapters to feel rushed and not well thought out. I mean, books with heavy internal dialogue, not involving much action, are fine for me, but I don't think this was the kind of book that Murakami was intending to write. I also get the feeling, and I couldn't really tell you, but I get the feeling that something was lost in translation from the original Japanese, because there are moments with regards to the prose that feel stilted or otherworldly, but not in a good way. It just feels like it was written by AI, and it feels kind of awkward. And I want to stress that Murakami has the ability to pull you in and paint a vivid world of modern Japan. He does it so well that it's just as immersive as the first few pages of, say, John Steinbeck's Canary Row. He's so good at it that sometimes I reread pages just to experience them. Unfortunately, that is missing here. Let's look at our characters. The two most important characters are part of the dual narrative, Tango and Omame. Tango is a 30-year-old man. He's a math teacher that works part-time, I believe. Omame is, well, let's just say that she has a much more interesting job. It's also a much more morally ambiguous job. I don't know if I should even use the word ambiguously. I'd say morally complicated job. These are the two that kind of supposedly in theory drive the story forward. We then have Fuki Iri, who is a 17-year-old girl. She seems to have certain learning disabilities, and I am not completely sure how intact with her mental faculties she is, which makes some of the scenes that she's involved with even more disturbing for me. Then we have the Dowager, and we have Tamaru, who is one of the most interesting characters as far as his background goes, but nothing ever comes of it. Like I probably have said before, the book has a lot of rifles on shelves in Act 1 that never really get fired by Act 3, and Tamaru is one of those rifles, so to speak. Then we have Ushigawa, and Ushigawa is by far one of the more interesting side characters to me, but not much is ever done with him. Now, as far as the main character here, Tango, I just find Tango kind of gross because when he meets Fuki Iri, he is very cognizant of the way she looks. He's looking at her breast, he's looking at her figure, he's basically dissecting her. And that's not to say that men aren't going to do that to a 17-year-old girl, but the way that it is written in the book just seems so, as a matter of fact, clinical and disturbing, I guess is the word that I should use. He reacts to events, he's boring, and he objectifies a 17-year-old girl. The next character, Omame, she is madly in love with Tango, even though she hadn't seen him since they were 10 years old. And by the way, the fact that they were 10 years old when they last saw each other makes it even more disturbing because they're both wanting to hook up again with what is in their mind the 10-year-old versions of themselves, if that makes any sense. And these are like 30-year-old characters by this point. Omame is overly sexualized, but she is self-determined. But damn, she serves as an extension of Tango. Then, of course, there is Fukieri. And I'm just going to say one thing about Fukieri. She's an object. She is treated as an object by every man that looks at her. Remember, this is a 17-year-old girl. Now, Ushikawa, as I've said before, is a really interesting character, but here he's the most interesting of the characters in my opinion. He's resourceful, he's complicated, he's morally ambiguous, he has an interesting past, but he serves only to repeat the exposition already known to the reader. The Dowager is an interesting character in and of herself. She's the one that assigns all of these, let's say, morally complicated assignments to Omame. Tomorrow is her help, and Tomorrow is also the guy that kind of provides what is necessary for Omame, the girl that gets all the assignments from the Dowager. This book has a lot of problems. First of all, the secondary characters are killed off or move on and have nothing to do with the overall story itself. The sex scenes are clinical. There's a lot of justifying of really disturbing aspects of the sex scenes. And sex is seen as hurtful or a means to an end here. The third act drags more than it should. It certainly drags more than the first and the second act. The sexual depictions of women are, well, unfortunate. In Omame's case, she is overly sexualized. She comes off almost like a manga character. Why Fukieri is sexualized the way she is, why justifications are written in there, I will never know. I don't understand. It made the book less palatable for me. So let's look at our overall grading of the book. Readability, I give this a full moon. It was easy to read. Pacing, I'm going to give it a very small sickle. My interest in it, a slightly larger sickle, and the overall grading, I'm going to give it a half moon. Now, not to poo-poo on Murakami because he is a substantial writer, I'm going to recommend these books instead if you want to read Haruki Murakami and you have not before. These books are a lot better than 1Q84 in my opinion, and some of them are just really great books. My favorite here is Kafka on the Shore. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle tends to be a fan favorite. The easiest one to read is After Dark, and the one up until 1Q84 that was the most popular in the West was Norwegian Wood. I do recommend that you check these books out. Alright, if you've liked what you've seen, please comment and subscribe. It would help me a lot. I'm trying to get this channel started. I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but I'm gonna try. Thank you very much.